Hello everyone, welcome to the first Rhodes talk of this semester. Delighted to introduce you to Professor Alex Cooley, who is a professor at Barnard College in political science, and someone I went to grad school with. So, since this is the age of nepotism, I thought that we'd go, anyway, put that to one side. Alex has almost been at Rhodes before. We tried to bring him up from his 2017 book, Exit from Hegemony, which really is worth a reread at this point. Very, very prescient for current events. But we're delighted to be able to bring him up for this one, Dictating the Agenda, How Authoritarians Are Transforming Global Governance. The floor is yours, Alex.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Mark. Thanks to everyone for being here. I know you have many other things that you can be doing here, so it's a real honor and a real pleasure. And also want to thank my co-author, who I believe is watching the live stream over in Ireland. This is Alex Dukalskis. This is a project that came together in 2020 and sort of took us in directions we were always sort of curious about, but it allowed us to really collaborate and think it through. So big thanks to him. And in some ways, this book is a kind of merging of kind of my previous work on international order. Mark mentioned Exit from Hegemony, and his work on the authoritarian sort of public sphere messaging strategies, and how authoritarians sort of 2.0 are much more sort of savvy about image management, reputation management, than perhaps we used to give them credit for. So I would prefer spending more time in discussion with you. So I'm just going to go through this pretty quick and give you a sense of some of the main arguments and a taste of some of the top line findings and some of the case chapters, as well as some of the analytical things that we're doing. Really, the first part of the book tries to look back on what we all think of now as the 1990s, right? This sort of zenith of U.S. soft power, liberal influence across the world, and sort of ask how did we understand and analyze these sort of trends in the 1990s, and perhaps what kind of biases and assumptions did that instill that has actually prevented us from seeing some of these contemporary challenges in global governance. And so this is sort of, one of everyone's all-time favorite anecdotes. This is Bill Clinton talking about China's accession in the WTO, making the point, as was shared by many at the time, that WTO accession would socialize China into the rules and norms of the liberal trading system, maybe even be an impetus for change. And he sort of volunteers to sort of, China's trying to crack down on the internet. Good luck with that, right? And so every piece of this has been falsified. The way we conceptualize it in the book is that we think of this apex of liberal influence in two streams, right? One is the kind of bedrock soft power stream that needs no introduction here, the Joe Nye sort of power of attraction argument. That's kind of the passive influence bedrock. And then the active influence part, right? Sort of liberal actors, NGOs, transnational networks, basically creating this new vector of liberal influence globally. And in fact, we had a really good book about it, award-winning book, Activists Beyond Borders, by Mimi Keck and Margaret's, Catherine Sickink and Mimi Keck, that sort of theorized, right, that liberal activism was actually a third vector in international politics, right? It was neither rooted in power politics that sort of states engaged in, and it was not rooted in profits, right, that sort of private companies were engaged in. It presented this sort of third vector, and transnational networks built on liberal universal principles were to have sway. So these analyses weren't wrong. They were just bound by some assumptions about the era. And if you look back at some of the very kind of successful transnational liberal campaigns, everything from the campaign to ban landmines, different individual rights, the anti-sweatshop campaign that you'll see there on your bottom right. We'll talk more about that a little later, as well as certain sort of environmental landmarks, right? There were a number of campaigns that we could call relatively successful. But I think if we dig a little more analytically, this isn't just a story of kind of misquoting Francis Fukuyama. There's, I think, sort of kind of like three main assumptions in both the passive story and the active story that we sort of look at. One is liberal influence, right? And assumptions of liberal influence rested on this idea of U.S. and Western expert and efficacious authority and appeal, right? The U.S. and West were just seemed better at doing stuff, right? That's why they were brought in to design post-communist constitutions, right? To design markets, to reform legal systems, right? A whole branch called technical assistance, right? Sort of was transmitting this kind of expert kind of knowledge, right? Second assumption, market power and Western consumer dominance, right, would inevitably also alter these various sort of global societies and states along the lines of what had happened, frankly, with the Soviet Union and East Europe, right? This was the very influential, and we'll put out sort of Dewey-Eikenberry argument, right, about integration into the globe and creating sort of demands through sort of economic integration. And then the third, and by the way, that's my sort of analogy. Paul Musgrave has a great sort of story on this. The Gorbachev Pizza Hut commercial, right at the bottom, you might recognize that, right? One of the influential spokespeople, sort of the last Soviet premier, sort of cutting an ad for Pizza Hut in Moscow in the 1990s. And then third was kind of a norm and an assumption of political autonomy in non-political spheres, right? And this is everything from beliefs in sort of central bank independence to sort of entertaining freedom of expression, sort of athletes, artists, the autonomy of NGOs and so forth, right? If groups had ways of sort of speaking out or doing things, that they should be allowed to do so, right? And again, all three of these turned out to have some severe weaknesses and flaws, right? As it turns out, there are complete limits, total limits that you can put on NGOs and curtail their autonomy, right? You can stigmatize them by branding them sort of foreign agents, as in the case of Memorial in Russia on the left. As it turns out, you can totally shut down the internet and control it. In some ways, sort of authoritarians are very well positioned to do that. And you can certainly launch sets of counter ideas within the knowledge-based system of the liberal core, which I'll talk about in a sec. But really, one of the main drivers here is just a very sort of simple market shift explanation, right? So here we see kind of the top quartile and the bottom quartile of sort of countries in the VDEM index. So the most liberal democratic countries in 1991, if you want to call it a cartel, an alliance, whatever you want to code them as, US, EU, Canada, Japan, accounted for 84% of global GDP, right? The least democratic quartile, 4% of GDP 91. Fast forward 30 years later, and we see liberal core still pretty high at 59, but the real shift is that the bottom quartile now is 26%. So that is China, that is Saudi Arabia, that is Russia, and so forth. And this sort of geoeconomic shift has had consequences across all of these areas that we sort of assumed were transmitters of sort of liberal norms. So there's a couple of cases in the book looking at both how this has complicated things like consumer boycotts and campaigns, as well as sort of the global strategy of sort of national sports leagues, and how this sort of Chinese market actually creates real complications in terms of thinking about strategic planning. Weaknesses and assumptions. Another one was that sort of liberal forms would necessarily bring influence, right? Without necessarily thinking about political context, distribution of sort of financing responsibilities. And this is sort of one of the interesting sort of areas we look at is sort of transnational higher ed, and how collectively in the mid-2000s, a bunch of universities, both in the US and the UK and elsewhere, sort of decided to go global, right? Part of that push really was about sort of grabbing revenues overseas from partners, but going global meant sort of disproportionately going to authoritarian countries, in particular sort of three clusters. Like, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A. Those clusters were Singapore, the Gulf, and China. All three now face really severe challenges for different reasons. Many of these partnerships have been curtailed for a number of different reasons, not just sort of political, but also financial. But in any case, the assumption was, oh, our brand name and our model, right? And you're the host and you're going to pay for it, right? And we are going to sort of socialize you into our Western sort of academic norms. Hasn't unfolded that way. But why did we actually expect that it would? Right? When you sort of think about that, right? But again, this assumption about norms. So I want to introduce the main analytic framework of the book. It's what we call the authoritarian snapback model. This is sort of our version of it's the kind of inverse of boomerang theory laid out in sort of Keck and Sickink. And this is basically the stages in which liberal external actors, right, whether they are NGOs, whether they are sort of companies that espouse a kind of a liberal sort of social mission, when they engage with sort of the savvy authoritarian, these are the stages in which they are brought to heel and under control, right? And so these are presented here sequentially. A lot of them are going on simultaneously, but just very briefly. First, the actor is stigmatized, right? So you're not an NGO, you're a foreign agent, you're a fifth column. You are an enemy of the people, you are a front for the CIA, right? Like the stigmatization occurring in official media and social media is really important, sort of redefining this actor as foreign and alien, inappropriate, right, for this context. Second is shielding, right? An attempt to actively shield the population from whatever the messaging or the advocacy effort is, right? Shielding can also be just frankly sort of censoring and banning. Third is what we call sort of reframing engagement, right? And this is where like a lot of the work is. So you often hear this idea that, you know, companies or organizations that go into authoritarian settings say, well, sure, you know, it's better to be engaged than not be engaged, right? Like engagement actually is productive, right? It leads to sort of exchanges of views, exchanges of values and so forth. And actually, this is where we see a lot of times the reverse happening. That once you have sunk costs in an authoritarian setting, reinscribing the parameters of what is permissible for you to do creates dilemmas for the actor, right? And the choices are to leave, right? Or to accept the new ground rules. Once you've accepted the new ground rules, you're already constrained, and then you are more likely to accept more and more constraints on your mission, to maybe even your mission is unrecognizable. Like, what are you doing there? What are you actually advocating and doing? The next two are transnational, right? Once this particular issue and this particular actor has been brought to heel, that this is sort of transmitted abroad, right? Through messaging, sort of lobbying of international institutions, other transnational actors. And the very final stage is the title of the book, Dictate the Agenda. And this is where the authoritarian state manages to completely change and transform the governance domain and how we view it, right? This is still relatively rare, right? Like you might think, yeah, maybe something like China and Hollywood movies might be one area, right? Where it's like pretty sort of ironclad. But so was extreme socialization and liberal norms and values, right? It wasn't, you know, we rarely reached that level of sort of like peak sort of liberal transformation, but that's the end point. So this snapback model runs through all of our different stories. We use a variety of different sort of data collecting strategies and different sources. Want to talk a little bit about the areas that we're exploring. So none of this is going to be surprising to those of you working on human rights or democracy promotion. And we actually did not want to do those cases, right? We wanted to look at areas that were outside of the purview normally of international relations scholars, and where there's like an assumption that these are liberal conduits, right? That these are sort of liberal conveyor belts. And so we picked global media. We looked at consumer boycotts. We looked at transnational higher ed, and we looked at global sports, right? And so I'll give you, some top line findings in some of these. So our media chapter, we do a couple of things. One, we want to show how this bedrock sort of soft power kind of arrangement has changed over the last 30 years, right? So both in terms of reductions in global news services in the West, and the growth of overseas bureaus, both in Russian and Chinese sort of state media. So sort of we have the flags there, and sort of you can see this is the Russia slide. A lot of overseas desks on the left. The other part of this, and this is sort of the China slide. The other part of this that we thought was really important is content sharing agreements, right? So like overseas bureaus are like kind of like the formal, the desk, the things that the Washington Post just sort of killed off, right? Those are all important. Even more important in this digital age is content sharing agreements. In other words, where you agree to take the feed, right, of a particular sort of news service, a news agency, and reproduce it as your own, right? Xinhua, Chinese state news agency, ITAR-TASS, they tend to either provide this at a very low cost or even give it away to certain sort of regional and local papers. And by these counts, we found over 300 Chinese content sharing agreements and 100 Russian content sharing agreements. Interestingly enough, the Russian map, they have the most content sharing agreements with China. China actually has the most content sharing agreements with Thailand. Massive sort of collecting this. But this is like the kind of, I would say sort of like the hidden agenda setting of sort of global media, like whose news feed covers global news, right? Like, second part of the chapter investigates the waning of another liberal norm, which is sort of the autonomy of foreign correspondents. In authoritarian settings, there are lots of NGOs who do a great job at documenting actual attacks on journalists, right, and foreign journalists. So we wanted to do something a little less obvious. We wanted to look at data on administrative actions taken against foreign journalists. So we compiled a data set, what we call authoritarian restrictions on foreign journalists, and basically looking at visa denials, expulsions, overstaying visas, right? These kinds of administrative sort of barriers that are put off, and like what the trend lines were. And basically it's getting worse. And these are the top offenders that you see. And what's sort of interesting, these are like different kinds of authoritarian regimes. Some are big, some are small. And so, again, it suggests to us that the norm itself is waning. Talk about a second illustration, which is the consumer boycott chapter, right? So this is an area in which, when you think about one of the classic activist campaigns from the 1990s, it was sort of, the Nike anti-sweatshop campaign, right? Which is this global coalition of organized labor, media coverage, activists, right, who basically documented the horrendous labor conditions in Nike's subcontractors across a lot of their East Asian hubs, right, places like Indonesia, as well as China and Vietnam. And the campaign, the bottom line is, by the late 1990s, it was actually really working, right? Nike's share price had collapsed or had been halved. Profits were way down. Phil Knight himself said that the campaign had been really effective. And it was sort of viewed as very big on college campuses, right? At the time, sort of chapters of this. And it was viewed as like one of these kind of classic examples of how you create a transnational kind of pressure campaign. So we contrast that in the book with the sort of fate of a kind of anti-Xinjiang cotton campaign that we've seen on a couple of dimensions. One is after credible allegations came out in 2019 of sort of these forced re-education camps in which hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs were being put into, there was another branch that documented, and Chinese authorities themselves admitted that they're being working in cotton fields, right? China produces about 20% of global cotton, and about 85% of that is produced in Xinjiang, right? And so a kind of classic attempt, right, to create a transnational campaign against the sourcing of cotton from Xinjiang sort of built up. And there were sort of, a few knock-on effects, but one was that the voluntary standards industry, sort of BCI, that was sort of tasked with sort of monitoring this, suddenly went dark, right? Their website sort of shut down. We started getting complaints in the Chinese media about the bias in these organizations. China itself started releasing its new global production standards and started accusing Western companies of bias for not adopting their own sustainable cotton production standards, right? So they go through the whole cycle. I'll briefly mention Swedish clothing company, H&M, right? So initially, they come out, they give sort of a statement about concerns of sourcing cotton from Xinjiang and sort of saying that they are going to ensure that their supply chains does not have any Xinjiang cotton. 6 months pass. Actually, there's no Chinese government reaction. But after the sanctioning of a number of sort of officials, a snapshot of the H&M statement is taken. It's on Weibo. It gets disseminated across Chinese press, and a full court press against H&M goes into effect. H&M closes most of its stores in China as a result. And then kind of to add even one more layer to this, then some Western companies see what's happening to H&M and start owning the fact that they're using Xinjiang cotton, right? So Muji is basically saying, yeah, we use Xinjiang cotton. We're proud of it, right? So again, some really interesting dynamics about sort of, the backlash there. Very finally, we can talk about higher ed if you want. Global sports follows. There's a lot going on here, right? There is the story of sports washing, which happy to talk about. I think we're more interested in the kind of market and consumer shifts and the kinds of drivers that is having on clubs and their sort of political standing, as well as the rise in investment from some sovereign wealth funds in sort of sports. And so this you see in sort of the Saudi slide to your right. That's the difference between 2021 and 2023, by the way, in the number of sort of sports the Saudi investment fund is going into. One area of particular sort of interest is the proliferation of speech codes across a lot of these sports, both informally and formally. So informally, I would say sort of the NBA spat with China as a result of the tweeting of the Houston Rockets general manager. Everyone knows the story, 2019, sort of professing support for sort of Hong Kong, essentially shuts down sponsorships and broadcasts of the NBA in China. Right, and take sort of a massive hit as a result of this. What I think the anecdote revealed was that so much of the revenue of the NBA comes from clothing stores in China, broadcast rights in China, but also individual player contracts, apparel contracts, sneaker contracts that they have in China can exceed the contracts that they have in the U.S. too. So all this, in essence, has created kind of a depoliticized sort of like informative environment where it's not okay to criticize the host country. Formally, though, we also see the proliferation of speech codes. Yeah, and so Formula One is a good example of this. Come out in sort of 2021 after actually Lewis Hamilton came out with some criticism. Abu Dhabi Grand Prix and Bahrain Grand Prix and so forth. if you want to talk about the Live Golf PGA proposed merger, right? One of the conditions of that merger is a non-disparagement clause against sort of Saudi Arabia sort of going through. So we see these sort of popping up in a bunch of sports in this sort of kind of context. So that's actually my last slide. I'll say a couple of things about the figure that has not been uttered in the first sort of 22 minutes of this talk, right? So we wrote this book and we got the galley proofs in sort of November 2024. We anticipated that this second term of the US president, we perhaps see elements of the liberal sort of backlash in these tactics being used. I think we underestimated the extent that a lot of these tactics would be used sort of overseas, and a lot of these sort of similar sort of governance domains or playbooks being used against sort of transnational higher ed, actually. So I'm happy to get into that. I will say that all these trends actually predate Trump, right? So like it's easy sort of to talk about sort of, Trump being mixed up and driving this and so forth, but these are trends that predate him. And he's certainly, I think, going to be an accelerant, right? So if we look at sort of, policies behind sort of media acquisitions, what happening with sort of like Paramount and CBS, or perhaps informal pressure on the Washington Post, right? Yes, I actually think Trump's involvement as host of the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup is probably going to lead to some pretty assertive attempts to sort of squash all kind of political expression, right? Out of this. One of the things that we talk about was the failed One Love campaign in 2022 in Qatar. People are sort of familiar with this, where European players wanted to wear sort of armbands in support of LGBTQ rights. And initially they were told that they were going to be fined if they did this, and they were willing to get the fine. And then on the night before opening play, Infantino, president of FIFA, said, no, actually, you're going to be issued a yellow card, right? Like this could be part of like the sanctioning, like on the pitch. And so the campaign was dropped. So again, I think the kind of, question of whether these sporting events are going to be politicized, right, by groups here in the U.S. or sort of abroad, protesting things like, perhaps like ICE policies or whatever happens to be, I think sets this up as a really sort of interesting arena for contestation. So I will stop there. I'm sure I have forgotten all sorts of things I wanted to share with you, but happy to take your questions and your comments. Yeah.
I have the microphone. I have two of them, actually. Lots of fun. There we go.
Hi, so thank you so much for this presentation and the book. I'm not too familiar with political science literature, so this was actually very fascinating. I wanted to ask you about the authoritarian snapback and whether the boomerang theory after liberalism could also be a story of the own limits of liberalism, and particularly the limits of neoliberal capitalism that has led to rising levels of inequality and exploitation, not only in the US, and actually whether how much that fed the rhetoric of Western ideals of anti-immigration and the other, particularly as Enzo Traverso explains on the rise of new fascism, this anti-Islam rhetoric that also got fed with the 2001 attack. So that this rise of post-fascism is kind of based also on the other ideology that was created with the limits of neoliberalism capital, and that fed the autocratic regimes that we see nowadays.
Thanks for that. So I think you'd have to connect the dots for me a little bit more specifically on this sort of the immigration issue and then sort of the limits with regards to the boomerang theory. I'll just mention a couple of things of context. Really, we start seeing this in the mid-10s, right? Like authoritarians are hanging around, they're more defensive, right? But they really become assertive, right, in the 10s. But before that, I actually think the boomerang model had two major not flaws, but I think we were actually applying it very selectively. One, and Cliff Bob did this very early on. We weren't applying it to the transnational right when we should have, right? If you look at the NRA campaign in the Brazilian gun reform, right, gun referendum, right, act, it's like classic boomerang pattern, right? And sort of Bob sort of shows this, as well as sort of the networking, World Congress of Families, a lot of these other kind of organizations, right? So we selectively wanted to look at, liberal sort of influencers instead of looking at sort of social movements that had all sorts of different politics, right? Including, Islamic radicalism in some cases too. So I think that's one. And then B, I really do think like this idea of creating a category of political actors that was different, right? Somehow I think took us away from sort of actually understanding a lot of the counter tactics that were going to sort of be imposed. Right, like, and in some ways, the creation of this as a third wave was a function of the assumptions, right, of liberalism. That this is this autonomous kind of sphere. So, yeah.
Alex, thanks so much for this talk. So your idea about kind of how economic integration is affecting international relations. Like I love this idea because there has been this long debate, as you well know, in IR about whether economic integration leads to peace, right? And there are people who are, very strong on this, very opposed. We're not going to settle it now. But what you're suggesting is that there's like this other vector, that it's not about peace, that it's about liberalism. And I think what I hear you saying is that in terms of economic integration between liberals and non-liberals, we thought the vector was going to go one way, correct, and we're actually hearing, the exact opposite. And so I like that. I'm sad about it, obviously. I think just two quick comments on it, and then I'll turn it over to you. One is just the middle part of what you're saying about the sort of, universities or sports leagues get there and then suddenly find that the rules have shifted. That sounds an awful lot like obsolescing bargain. This is like that classic sort of investment idea. And the other thing is that it reminds me of is with climate politics, we've been doing this to a certain extent in the same way, where from roughly 2000 to 2020, we studied the green movement and only recently have suddenly sort of shocked and discovered like, wow, there's an anti-green movement and it's really, really powerful and effective and having results. And so, I think you're driving home the fact that researchers' own biases, drive the research agenda that they pursue. Like, it just kind of continues to play out in IR and probably lots of other fields as well. Yeah,
no, thanks for that, Chuck. And I mean, you and Mark are, really ahead of the curve on greenwashing and the backlash against it. I mean, I would say, whatever happens over the next year or three, I think in terms of research agendas, I think it's safe to assume that we're going to have competing transnational networks in almost every domain that's viewed as politically significant, right? Whether it's in the environment, whether it's sort of gender rights, whether it's immigration, right? We need to be ready for that conceptually, right? Both to studying them sort of individually and the interactions of them, and also at the kind of like parapublic stage, right? Because a lot of the dynamics you're talking about, starts out in red states, right? That are very actually organized in terms of sort of, different sort of state legislatures, Secretary of States, right? The sort of like regulatory apparatus being sort of wielded to sort of like pressure sort of companies, right? So these kinds of tactics, right? You can imagine them being deployed for favored outcomes in either like red or blue states, but the transnational nature of them, I think, is something that we need to be aware of. And if it's the case that we're completely deinstitutionalizing the federal government, maybe that's where political contestation is actually going to happen on some of these issues going. But that's just pure speculation on my end. But yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating presentation, and also not policy background. So, but I have been kind of growing up on the receiving end a lot of the authoritarian propaganda. So it's been interesting to see kind of this take on it. And I love the maps you had of like Russian and Chinese media organizations outside of those countries. Yeah. And I didn't quite realize the extent of it, which was really, I think, fascinating. One of the things I've been wondering about is, I think specifically in Russian media discourses, there's been the shift from the 2000s, from focusing on the domestic issues, and now lots of the media focuses on the U.S.
Yeah.
And there is both pushback against anti-liberal values, but also there is lots of talk about kind of U.S. hegemony, U.S. imperialism. And I'm kind of wondering, that is an appealing narrative. Because they're saying it's the position of the way the U.S. is positioning itself, it's not necessarily the right way. Yeah. And that is also, I could imagine, appealing to a broader range of population around the world.
Absolutely.
And so, how do you make sense of that in the book? And I just kind of, I guess, coming back also to Zara's question, there's been such a profound levels of increasing inequality throughout the world. Yep. And kind of lots of Western hypocrisy of what countries should or could not do.
Yeah.
And do you think this is kind of an effective strategy they've been employing and kind of shifting that focus towards being very much U.S.-centric in their critiques?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for all those. I mean, the short answer is yes. I think you see it in sort of global support for Ukraine, frankly. What the Russians managed to do very successfully, right, through these kinds of networks is to say, no, this isn't actually about demilitarizing or denazifying sort of Ukraine. This is a referendum on U.S. order, right? And I would encourage everyone to look at Putin's second annexation speech of the 4 Ukrainian provinces. It's an incredible speech, right? Because he's talking about double standards, triple standards, U.S. hypocrisy, colonialism, the dollar. There is a paragraph in there about the evils of gender reassignment surgery, right? So ask yourself, what is this sort of diatribe on gender reassignment surgery doing in an annexation speech, right? And yet it's part of this messaging, right? Making this about a backlash about all of these norms and sort of picking them up and deploying them in this kind of weaponized sort of selective way. So it's been very, very successful there. Here we do sort of accounts. We give some examples. Just a couple of things just from some follow-up work. Certainly, there are regional differences in Russian narratives, right? So if you look at sort of African content and recontent, it tends to be more kind of positive authoritarianism about what Russia is bringing, right? The target there is not so much the U.S., it's France, right? And the colonial legacies that's left. If you switch to Latin America, it really is imperialism. And I would say the way everyone went about sort of kidnapping sort of Maduro lends a lot of credence to some of these Russian narratives that were starting to accelerate from October or December that were disproportionately focused on Venezuela and U.S. lawlessness and so forth. And in general, Russian media had a brief flirtation with memes that Trump is unpredictable, right? That he's shaking things up, right? Which was the case in January and February, and now has reverted back to the same kind of regional memes. And there was Zaharova's sort of observation when Doge sort of shut down USA that, good riddance, we've been warning you about this sort of for a while. So that was sort of one direct kind of wing it. But yeah.
So thank you for this. It was really interesting. I had my juices going in lots of different dimensions. But I wanted to push a little bit on the point Jeff raised, which is that at least in part of this, the causal mechanism, if there is one, is this market share thing, I think, that all of a sudden, because the world GDP has shifted towards the production in authoritarian countries, that's the origin. And that I find a little weird because, we can date the authoritarian moments in China, 1989, its early Tiananmen, Russia. They don't have yet the market share, and it's not the market share that's driving it. So the market share is facilitating something that's larger, and that I think is part of this. Yeah. And I just wanted to ask you about, what role is the market share playing in the analysis exactly? Is it a facilitator and an accelerant? Yeah. Or something else? Because it seems in some... Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Totally valid. This is this is more kind of like a how story than a why precisely these things happen kind of story. Just a thing. I think it's both, right? I think it informs sort of realizations that there are certain the composition of the consumer market is now that certain types of political expression, right, or certain social agendas, these are things you want to stick clear of, right? That's the NBA story. And remember, the story of engaging with the NBA had like a very different concern in the 2000s. That was like, are we going to turn China into like a Disneyland, right, of US type of consumers with US sort of values? And you say, well, maybe that sort of happened with the NBA, but certainly in terms of sort of like the politics and the red lines, those are there. The places where I would say it's actually more of a causal driver are places like F1, right? Where within a span of 10 years, we go from having no Formula One races, right, in non-democracies, right, to having 7 of them, right? And so sort of collectively, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, if you want to throw in Hungary, right, Russia, right? This starts to be an issue in terms of sort of F1 concerns about the coverage of these sort of particular events. And then when athletes start weighing in, right? So there maybe it's a little more proximate, but I think, I take your point. I think my caveat would be that right now there's a clear ascendancy, right, in terms of like, and sort of front foot forward on a lot of this sort of pushback behavior. Right. So the kind of pushback that you get from Qatari authorities sort of very overtly, I would say becomes more and more of an accelerant. If I had to, and I'm not a China specialist, but like if I had to sort of pick a turning point, and we talk about a little bit about this in the book, it's 2008. It's the run up to the Olympics. Right. And in the run up to the Beijing Olympics, the summer games, you see all this kind of like liberal advocacy apparatus deployed. Right. So Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, they come out with a bunch of reports on what's happening in China. Right. They're issuing regular reports to the Olympic Organizing Committee, concerns about our foreign journalists kind of access to the internet. Right. The Tibet protests, all this kind of stuff. And it seems that's a real learning moment. Right. So the Chinese launch global media after the Olympics. Right. In part, they want to control the narrative. Fast forward. It's a very imperfect analogy. 2022 Winter Games, you see none of this, right? So Biden tries a diplomatic boycott, goes over like a lead balloon. The corporates want to have nothing to do with a boycott or outspoken. Athletes have to download a particular app, right, that has sort of surveillance technologies on it, right? So we're in a very different place in China in between these two sort of games.
All right, I'll try to be short about this. I mean, keep on hearing about Trump being a fascist. I think he's more of an isolationist. When I'm thinking fascism, I'm thinking of, say, death vans, slave-based cotton production, what's happened to the Falun Gong, the integration of corporate power with socialism has created kind of a corporate socialism. And that's the main reason why you see these autocracies. The problem you had with Russia, you've enslaved the population. You have the agricultures on kolotsas, they're on state farms. And you're not producing anything. You can't do anything with these people. They pretend to pay us. We pretend to work. Well, China has fixed that problem. They found a way to use their people like slaves and high-end, highly educated, quality work, as far as you can get from slaves. That's spreading. I don't know if anybody here listens to Neil Ferguson. It's like he was talking about Cold War 2.0.
Yeah.
And it's not just 2009. Daniel Ortega is back in Nicaragua. He's still there. Yeah. I don't think the problem is right-wing fascism, a.k.a. what's going on in Argentina. I think that's more libertarianism. Yeah. So I have called Trump many things. I've never called him an isolationist. Right? Like what is
I think Trump is absolutely an internationalist. He's not a liberal internationalist.
Why the tariffs?
Right? So that he can issue exemptions, right?
To protect the American. Who is voting for Trump? May I? Because as a person who's on that side, who's not, trust me, I'm not a fascist. It's people who don't have jobs. People from the coal industry.
Sure.
People from the Rust Belt.
Yep.
People used to know that there was work in the U.S. There were jobs. There were companies, and they can see China's doing a lot of things that we're supposed to be worried about global warming. China just added in 2025 more coal-based electric production than the entire United States has.
Yeah.
I think it was 187 gigawatts. They got 220 they added to their, and they're adding nuclear and they're adding.
My friend, this is taking us rather far from what he's talking about.
My argument is there is a reason for the autocracies rising, and it's not necessarily a fascist conspiracy on the right. I think it's money based. That's why Confucian Institute has influence with.
Let's see what Alex says.
All right, I'm sorry to rant.
Yeah. Yeah, so Confucian institutes are actually really interesting, right? If you run it as a franchise, you might.
Please.
Yeah. There's a lot to go over. I would just say the question to me in Trump isn't about isolationist or not, right? Or sort of like these sort of classic paradigms. It is which international actors are finding favor with Trump, right? Why is it that Trump goes to the Gulf, right, for his first sort of set of sort of international engagements, right, and announces 3 mega deals all funded on Gulf sovereign wealth funds, right? It's because he can blend, right, the commercial deals that are on the books anyway with official agreements with the private deals, right? Licensing sort of in crypto, sort of Trump properties and so forth, right? So that's the model that he's comfortable with, right? State-run capitalism, right, where you funnel things through decision makers, right? Ruling families is perfect, right? Because like then you don't even have to sort of deal with others, right? So and why is it that you're concerned about sort of, traditional allies, right? Or sort of institutionalized like regulatory processes in the EU? Because you actually can't control those. You can try and actually sort of stigmatize them, take them down, sort of accuse them of sort of like violating the First Amendment, but they're not controllable and they're actually sort of powerful, right? So I think it's a choice of like what kind of global partnerships. It's not a matter of like retreating from the world or embracing the world. But thank you. Yeah.
The boomerang you were talking about?
What? No, you asked about Trump, so
you said, well, Trump might be using that same method with NATO, for example. Stigmatize, really get direct control.
No, that was less about NATO, and that was more actually about media sort of acquisitions, right?
Eden, you're up.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I think the phenomena that illiberal ideas are so popular around the world, even in democracies these days, is a real big puzzle for us. My question here is about the outcome or the unit of analysis here in those, for example, in democracies, in people in democracies, whether is it the government or the firms or like average citizens that receive this kind of authoritarian snapback, those kind of agendas or ideas advertised by those authoritarian governments. I think here, based on the story, we can easily tell why those multinational corporations and celebrities, they are kind of accepting or allow those authoritarian agenda or ideas because of their interest. But what's the mechanism here that after those firms adopt these ideas or like accept them tacitly, how does that translate into the preferences of average citizens or governments in the West?
Yeah. So I think there is an interaction between them, right? So saying one is bigger than the others. I would say sort of, if you want to call it populism and liberalism, whatever it is sort of, domestically within sort of liberal democracies, actually primes for the normalization of a lot of these other kinds of influences and countermeasures, right? So you are, if you support Ellison taking over Paramount, right? Like in that acquisition deal, you have no problem, right? That a lot of the investment capital comes from, Abu Dhabi, right? Like in terms of like an investor, right? In other cases, like the support comes not for any kind of political or kind of social. There's Saudis have invested in your team. Your team is good, or the Russian oligarch has invested in your team. Your team is good. They have captured efficacious authority. right? Like they get away from it. Like people don't, and there'll be this cycle, right? This sort of like initial, this is really bad, right? We need to fight this, even sort of like create these kinds of, supporters, kind of conglomerates, and then over time it starts to dissipate, right? So I think there's different reasons for sort of accepting, but certainly, the rise of illiberalism, backlash, like within the West, is an absolutely important like part of the story, right? This isn't primary sort of over that, but I do think, there is a kind of a readying effect, right? For sort of accepting a lot of these influences. And you sort of see it also in discourse about sort of the role of independent media, right? Or journalistic norms and stuff. Thanks.
Anyone else?
The great talk. Thank you very much. It's hard to imagine, to dictate the agenda, right?
Yep.
Unless the authoritarian capitalism is a more effective system,
Right.
Like to promote that. What's your thought on it?
I think if we're actually dictating the agenda, then, maybe we're not even having this talk, right? So that's the extreme outcome, right? But it's also the goal, right? In terms of like a lot of sort of like transformation in terms of sort of global politics, right? And I think, yes, so, capitalism, different sort of, strands of it from, investment funds to sort of companies are an important lever, but so is having an actual sort of investment in the sort of like the technology of global governance, right? So if you are retreating, right, from 60, 70, 80 international organizations, right, they're going to be a lot more susceptible to the countries that are still engaged and frankly sort of funding them, right? And so this is the WHO story, right? Frankly, after sort of like US pullout, and so China sort of takes advantage of that. I think aspirationally we're in a very sort of different world, but it's a world of sort of contestation. I don't want to make it seem as if Beijing or Moscow or Riyadh, right, is going to have its sort of, agenda imposed all the time. No. But these issues are being contested, and these values and these norms in a very robust way, in a way that they just like weren't even 15 years ago.
That's great. It's 1:00. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot.